would describe my mother is very beautiful, very loving, everything a mother is supposed to be.
Jenora and I had this bond. She was very protective of me, which is funny because she was the younger sister.
I'd just been asked if I'd killed my mother. I was frantic, and I was screaming.
Jenora was stabbed almost 30 times.
But the crime scene left a lot of questions. No evidence, no leads, so many twists and turns.
Jenora was very good at covering things up. You drive yourself crazy thinking up all these things that could have happened. It never leaves your mind. Jenora was a sweetheart. She was funny and witty, just like our dad. She was very athletic. She used to speed skate and played softball. She was good at everything she did.
Glenda McCrae and her sister Jenora Stevens are more like best friends than siblings.
It was like, you've heard of soul sisters? That's how we were. We'd talk on the phone plus have lunch every day. And she was a talker like I am. She told me everything, and I told her everything.
My mom was fantastic. She was my best friend growing up because I didn't have brothers or sisters. My mother and I did a lot together. She was the quintessential baseball mom, for sure.
Troy was a little ornery, fun. He loved sports. And he spent a lot of time at the ballpark. He was a good ball player.
She was at every practice, every game. My father coached the team, but my mother was the glue, and she was my biggest fan.
She was super involved. Troy was kind of her whole life, to be honest with you. He really was. On May 12th, 1987, Jenora and I did not have lunch because she said she was going to have lunch with her husband, Phil, because her husband and my husband were going to go fishing that evening.
As their husbands will be at the lake, the sisters make plans of their own that day.
Me and Carrie went to Jenora's house because we were all going to go shopping for a prom dress for my daughter, Carrie. Later that week, there was a prom at the private school that Troy and my daughter, Carrie, attended.
When me and my mother arrived, Troy and Jenora were arguing.
Troy had gone to have his hair cut that day. He was due to have his pictures taken for school before the prom, and she wanted his hair to be longer. And because of that, Jenora was furious.
They were loud, yelling at each other, going back and forth. And so me and my mother stepped into the bathroom and shut the door. And we were kind of overwhelmed by that. I don't think it was very unusual for them to argue like that, but at the intensity that they were arguing, it was pretty high.
She and I had words. It was a little more out of hand than it should be.
The blow-up continues until Troy has to leave to go to a defensive driving class.
I had gotten my first car, and I got into a little fender bender, and I had to do that to keep my insurance clear. The last words that I heard from my mother were, "I love you." And we'll talk when we get home.
We spent all evening looking for a prom dress. And we got back to Janora's house, and she got out of the car and went to the back door. And she came through the house and went to the front door and opened the door and stepped out on the step and waved bye to me. And I thought, good, she's okay. So I went home. I would never have guessed that would be the last time I'd ever see her. And still to this day, I can't believe it, you know.
Glenda and Carrie head for home. Troy Stevens arrives back at his mother's house half an hour later.
I got home after school at about 10 o'clock. When I walked into the house that night, from the doorway, I could see her laying in the floor. The closer I got, the more vivid it became. I saw my mother just brutally just butchered. I don't know how else to put that. There are certain things we're just not meant to see. I remember physically going into shock. Strangest thing, but from the shins up, I remember that. I just remember that feeling in my body. I was pretty frantic, and I was screaming. I wasn't trying to piece together what had happened. I just knew that my mother was gone. I backed up into the kitchen to go use the phone and got an ambulance on the way.
Next, Troy calls his Aunt Glenda's house.
I was on the phone talking to my boyfriend, and on the other line, I got a beep in, and it was my cousin Troy. And he was yelling, he was screaming, "I need to talk to Aunt Glenda."
And he said to me, "Aunt Glenda, you better come quick. Mama's on the floor." I said, "Honey, she's probably fainted," because we do that a lot in our family. I said, "Okay, honey, I'll be right there," because I could tell he was scared.
I sat next to my mother while I was waiting on the police. And then I remember the sirens, all the emergency personnel showing up.
We were the first car there, so we got out of our car, walked up and approached that front door, and we remained quiet so we could listen and see if we could hear a fight or a disturbance inside. I remember it was very quiet. We knocked, nobody answered. I pushed the door open, and it was then I could see from the porch all the way back to the den, Janora leaning against a wall in a somewhat seated position. She was wearing her night clothes. She appeared to have sustained multiple wounds. You could tell that there had been a tremendous struggle. It was an extremely vicious attack. It was probably one of the worst crime scenes I had ever seen. Someone had attacked her with such aggression that she was almost decapitated.
Carrie and I started driving to Janora's house, and as we turned the corner, about halfway down the street, I saw lights, I could see the yellow tape and a truck in the driveway.
My cousin Troy was sitting on the curb, and he had a bat, a baseball bat, aluminum bat, laying like next to him.
His hands were on his head, and he was going like this. And he was shaking. And the first thought that came to my mind was, oh my God, did they get in another fight? And I went over and hugged him because I just thought, oh my God, you know, what in the world happened?
My mother was dead on the floor in a pool of blood. I didn't know how to rationalize what was happening. I didn't understand it.
I think that when the young man saw what he saw, I think it just overwhelmed his senses. And he just seemed like he was very confused and disoriented to me.
After talking to Troy, Patrol Officer Clark secures the scene and waits for homicide detectives to arrive.
On that night in May, it was a normal night, although it was a little humid, which actually played a factor into this investigation later on. I didn't know what I was walking into. Genora was lying on the floor of the kitchen wearing a maroon house robe. There was a large amount of blood. The TV was on in the adjoining family room. There was a kitchen and a bar, and it looked like the incident happened there. There were some broken pieces of a large knife, which indicates that knife hit something hard and it broke. So that struck me as really brutal, a lot of force. This knife looked like it came from a kitchen drawer, so maybe this wasn't a premeditated murder. On the hallway wall to the left, there was a couple large blood smears, which indicated to me that the victim came in contact with that wall, probably trying to get out the door.
She almost got out. Do you know how many times I've thought about, well, what if she had? She's that far away. Breaks my heart.
Detective Huff searches the home, looking for a motive or any clues as to what happened.
The residence didn't appear to be ransacked. It wasn't missing articles of expensive, nice televisions, a stereo. There was even $1,000 cash. So I didn't think that a burglary or robbery had occurred. The crime scene left a lot of questions. There was a fingerprint technician that went through the house. I don't recall that he got any prints that were valuable enough to be compared. But there were numerous strands of hair, which appeared to be the victim's.
Next, Huff focuses on investigating those closest to Genora, starting with her son, Troy.
There were circumstances where it made you think that Troy could be a suspect. There was no signs of forced entry. He had an argument with his mother that night, and he left, and it wasn't on the best of terms.
The police were, in the very beginning, checking out Troy, if he was on drugs, if he was an alcoholic, and all that kind of stuff. Understandably so, because we even questioned it as the family for a while.
Glenda can't help thinking about that phone call from Troy on the night of her sister's murder.
He never said one word about, oh my God, there's blood everywhere. I mean, that's the first thing that would have come out of my mouth. And I always wondered why. you know? I thought maybe he knows more than he's telling me.
I spoke with Troy for quite a while. Troy was upset.
I'd just been asked if I'd killed my mother. What in the hell are you talking about? Did I kill my mother? I believe anyone would immediately take offense to that, especially an irrational kid that just found his mother murdered like a farm animal.
That's just part of the job. You have to sometimes be the bad guy. You have to sometimes kind of test those limits to see what the response is. But we saw Troy very soon after the discovery, and his reactions were consistent with somebody just discovering a tragedy. So I didn't come away thinking he was a viable suspect. About, I'm wanting to say 1 or 2 in the morning, Phil, the husband, arrived home. I spoke to him and found out that he had come home from a fishing trip. Phil's demeanor was demanding answers, what happened to my wife. But I don't recall Phil being very candid about their relationship.
If you just met Phil on the street, he was a nice enough guy. He was a nice looking guy. He had been a Marine, so I always respected him for that. I acted like I liked him because of Janora. But I didn't like him, never liked him. He was a shyster.
Phil was my uncle and a real strict father to Troy. Very controlling, very intimidating. When I went over to their house, I would always ask my cousin, will you go get me a drink? Because I really was kind of scared of him.
Janora was very good at covering things up and being loyal to her husband, but you could tell because she'd have bruises and, you know, I encouraged her, to be honest with you, to leave him. Like most battered wives, they don't do it.
Janora's sister Glenda has good reason for suspecting Phil.
The night that we went shopping, she said to me, Glenda, if anything ever happens to me, will you promise me that you will never let Troy live with Phil's mother? And I said, of course. You don't have to worry about him if anything ever happened to you, but it's not going to. When you look back at it, you're like, oh my God, she said that to me. You know? Was there something to be afraid of? It haunts me.
The autopsy showed that Janora was stabbed almost 30 times. It was all over her body. Her neck was cut open in a huge gash.
And what it tells me is that there's a lot of anger, a lot of rage, a lot of very personal.
There were traces of semen that were found on her body that shows she was sexually assaulted sometime during this intrusion.
This was before DNA. It's not going to lead you to an exact person.
And she had severe gashes in her fingers and her hands where you could tell that she had tried to deflect the knife.
She was feisty and she was a fighter. And I can't help but think that she was scared to death. And just that in itself, it was the most horrible thought, that she was that scared. And I know she was.
With no new leads from the forensics, suspicion shifts back to Janora's husband.
I did think Phil was capable of murdering my sister. Yes, I did. I suspected Phil because he acted so remorseful. About a week or so after her funeral, Phil said that he wanted to go and get her clothes and pack them. And so I went with him because, I felt sorry for him. And Phil sat in the floor and opened the drawer of the dresser and took her lingerie out and smelled it. It was weird. And then he literally just got rid of everything that reminded him of her in a week. Didn't even ask any of us if we wanted anything of hers. Phil ended up marrying a girl that he went to high school with 3.5 months or so after Janora was buried. And Janora and I both knew he was seeing her before. And so that was even harder. It just made me hate him that much more.
We did take a set of fingerprints to see if they matched anything in the blood because it's his house. His fingerprints will be there. But if there was a print in the blood, that would be a big deal. And there weren't. There was no evidence, no leads. Phil had an alibi that he was fishing. That alibi checked out. We just got past him as a suspect. Having a bad marriage doesn't automatically make you a killer.
Almost convinced that Phil has nothing to do with Janora's murder, Huff falls back on old-fashioned police work, looking for fresh leads.
I spent a lot of time just sitting in the neighborhood, just watching what was going on, just getting the idea of what this neighborhood was like.
3 months after the murder, Huff's patience pays off.
In early August, I saw a couple girls sitting in a car down the block, smoking marijuana. And I asked them, "Do you remember when that lady got murdered?" And they said, "Oh, yeah. That night, we were sitting down here, and this guy came walking up to our car, asked us to give him a ride somewhere." And they said, for some reason, he had on a light blue jean jacket, and it was buttoned all the way up. And that was very odd because it was so warm and humid. They saw some scratches and marks on his neck that made them think he'd been into a fight. And this really interested me. Hey, we're on to something. We've got a path here, so let's go with it. They told me the guy's name was Quentin Barnes.
Quentin Barnes was a teenager. He had some background in some minor crimes, either drugs or property crimes, but no crimes of violence that we knew at that time. He was living on and off next door to Janora Stevens. His sister, Victoria Barnes, lived in the house next door, and he would stay sometime with her and her boyfriend.
Huff checks the sister's address. Quentin Barnes is not there.
I did speak to Victoria Barnes about her brother, and she was not uncooperative, but she had no information that was helpful that she would share with me.
She defended her brother and said that there's no way that he could have been involved in such a horrific or brutal crime.
Ultimately, I figured out where Quentin was staying, and I put together an affidavit for a search warrant to search for any evidence, specifically for a jean jacket. I found an unkept apartment, and I went into a closet, and there was a light blue jean jacket laying on the floor. I was so excited. Now here I am on the right track. When the jacket was analyzed, they found a hair that was brown. It was dyed, as was Janora's hair. It was the same color. So I'm thinking, wow, this is good. I potentially have big evidence. The evidence that we had is a jean jacket like the one Quentin Barnes was observed wearing that night. And on that jean jacket, there was a hair that was consistent with the victim's.
Detectives send the hair for testing to try and prove for certain that it matches Janora Stevens.
But the analysis of the hair came back that it was not Janora's hair. It wasn't Quentin Barnes either.
I wasn't happy with the process. I just felt that I didn't have people that really were up to date on the science.
Despite the test results, Detective Huff's gut tells him Quentin Barnes is somehow involved in Janora Stevens' murder.
So I go talk to Quentin, and he denied, saying he was never in the house, didn't have anything to do with it. Just the look in his face and his tone of voice. I'm thinking this guy's a ticking time bomb. And I was really getting upset with myself and not getting everything that we needed. You know, you get frustrated, but you try not to let it bother you. And then I got promoted, and you have to go back to a uniform division for at least a year to learn how to be a supervisor. So I was away from investigations, and at the same time, I'm going through a really ugly divorce, okay? That kind of threw me for a loop. You know, it really stalled things a bit. These cases do affect your home life. I was always on call. I had a couple sleeping bags at my office. And so a lot of times my kids had to go to sleep at the police station. There is a balance that I didn't find.
With Huff off the homicide beat, the case of the murdered mother goes as cold as an Oklahoma ice storm.
It got cold. It got really cold. And for a while we were thinking, no, they're never going to solve it. You drive yourself crazy thinking up all these things that could have happened. And you get so frustrated. Everyone has their own ideas of what happened, of who was involved, and who the killer is. It never leaves your mind.
After Mike Huff completes his supervisor training, he's promoted to head up Tulsa PD's homicide unit and picks up where he left off on Janora's murder.
When I first got back, I kind of assessed where we were, you know, where the hair evidence was, what its status was.
Huff had never been happy with the first analysis of the hair found on Quentin Barnes' jacket, so he requests a closer forensic examination.
The jean jacket was sent for forensic analysis. At that point in time, the Tulsa Police Department lab had hired a forensic analyst who had previously worked for the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, and it completely overruled the first hair analysis. Yes, there is a match on the hair. Janora's hair was on the jacket.
And there's more damning evidence on Quentin Barnes' jacket.
Fibers were found that matched the robe that Janora Stevens was wearing when she died. And loose fibers were found under her fingernails that matched the type of fibers that were in the jean jacket that was in Quentin Barnes' closet. And it would be consistent with clawing at her attacker.
I mean, this is telling a story. It was coming together. All I needed was a final piece of evidence.
There were now 3 different ways that tied Quentin Barnes to the scene that night forensically: the hair, the robe fibers, and the jean jacket under her fingernails. That forensic evidence was huge.
This case is coming together piece by piece.
Detective Huff re-interviews Quentin's sister, Victoria, who lived next door to the crime scene. So much time has passed that she's more willing to talk. And what she says blows open the case.
Now, she was more open to telling me some more facts. She said that Quentin made comments to her admitting guilt, that he killed her and will never find the knife.
It was a huge break in the case.
So I convinced the DA to file the charges, to issue an arrest warrant. And I told him our best bet is to me to talk to Quentin when he's in custody.
The determination was made that we're going to charge this case. We believe we have a strong enough case to convict him with what we have now, and we think the time to go forward is right now. Quentin Barnes, at this point in time, years after 1987, was now married, had a good job, was, if you would, an outstanding member of the community.
I found him at his home. He opened the door. I said, Quentin, we need to go. He goes, Mike, you know, I didn't kill that woman. I said, Quentin, you're under arrest for murder.
Never had heard of him, ever. I never even heard that name, period. Quentin. We were elated just that someone had been arrested. Just happy that it was going to be solved.
Mike brought Quentin Barnes down to the police station and had a video set up to video record the statement that Quentin Barnes was going to give. At the time, that was unique.
You have the right to remain silent. You do not have to answer any questions or make any statement. Do you understand that right? Yes. I know it's tough, Quentin, but it's important that you get this straight. Remember in as much detail as you can. I need to hear what happened, Quentin.
Oh, God. He was initially a bit confused. You know, why now? Why didn't we do this 6 years ago or whatever? But he was nervous.
I was living with my sister. Just kind of hit and miss and doing drugs. What kind of drugs were you doing?
Cocaine.
Were you stealing to support your habit?
Occasionally.
Barnes admits to breaking into Janora's house on that night, back in May 1987.
I got him to draw the interior of the house on a chalkboard.
We came back, we waited out here, went back in. Here's the living room here. month or something like that.
And it was good. I mean, if I hadn't been in that house, I wouldn't have known that it was so accurate.
So Quentin Barnes admitted to being there, but being there with his sister.
I don't know what she was going to get. She just said that we was going to try to get some drug money.
And you said Victoria wanted you to go with her so you could watch.
Just to watch and see if somebody came home or not. I wasn't in there that long.
Said you were in there for 3 minutes.
I seen my sister pick up the knife after they started wrestling around.
He pointed the finger at his sister entirely.
I did not kill her. My sister did.
You're saying that you saw your sister Victoria stab Janora Stevens, and you didn't do anything to go help the lady. And out of all the times that I've talked to you the past 7 years, you've not once told me this story.
It was just grasping at straws to try to blame the sister. It just didn't work.
She always told me that she would try to tell him that I'd tell everybody that I did it, that I was there, that I stabbed her. I did not stab her. She stabbed her.
But Victoria Barnes had an alibi because she and her husband were at a bar the hours during the murder.
I saw Victoria drive down the street and come home probably about 11:30 or 12 o'clock midnight that night, and we were able to go back to the bar. They knew her. They knew her husband. I said, oh, yeah, she's here all evening. So she's out of it. Plus the fact that there's sperm in Janora's throat. There's no way you can shift that blame to Victoria.
Did you have sex with that woman?
No, I did
I
not.
want you to look me in the eye, and I want you to tell me, did you sexually touch that woman that night?
No, I did not, Mike.
We're walking down the hall to get booked into jail. I said, Quentin, if you didn't have sex with her, how did sperm get in her throat? And he says, my sister's bisexual. And I said, you're crazy. Holy cow, that was really stupid. You know, he just dug himself a deeper hole.
Barnes never quite confesses to the murder on videotape, but his story is so implausible, prosecutors are confident of a conviction.
The trial was tense because it was a death penalty case. So there's a tremendous amount of emotion. It's just the stakes are the ultimate.
After 7.5 years, the thing that was the most shocking to me was walking in and him looking at me, staring at me. And I just stared a hole through him the whole time. I just stared a hole through him.
The picture I painted for the jury is that Quentin Barnes went to that house to do a burglary, but there was a confrontation where he was discovered in the house and ended up stabbing her 30 times. That video is extremely powerful. As a jury, they want to see the reaction, the body language, how their eyes are darting in and out. Did they hesitate? But it wasn't the end of the case because it was he said, she said. How will the jury take a he said, she said finger pointing between a brother and sister that were now, if you would, estranged? We had to build those pieces to exclude Victoria and then use that forensic evidence that we had that clearly focused on Quentin Barnes as being the killer. I put a tremendous amount of stock in the blue fibers that were found from his jean jacket. And the fingernail fibers show he was the one being clawed at. It wasn't that he was just in a back room while his sister was doing all this work.
When Victoria told her story, then that nailed him.
Quentin Barnes was found guilty of first-degree murder.
The day they read the verdict, it was a whole new set of emotions. because it had been as long as it had been.
I felt so satisfied. You know, it's a big portion of my life. It was like 7 years, and that was a hard 7 years.
We were all just crying to ourselves and hugging each other and everything, and it just felt wonderful. We were like, finally, you know, this has come to an end.
The jury came back with a recommendation of life without parole. There was a strong sentiment in the room that death was an appropriate punishment in this case, but you need 12, and there was somebody in the room that was not willing to make that step.
In the end, Quentin Barnes takes that final step by himself.
A couple days after trial, Quentin Barnes took his own life by overdosing on pills in the Tulsa County Jail. Ultimately, we were asking for the death penalty, and we got it.
Quentin Barnes, he got what he deserved.
Divine intervention. That's exactly how I felt. That was his admission right there.
My mother's murder, it has formed a lot of my life. It's made me a very cautious person. I've tried over the years to keep this in perspective. It became about life now and not about life without a mom.
I loved her so much. I can't even tell you how much and how special she was to me. When she was murdered, it was just like I lost my right arm. She was just my baby sister.
I don't like to think of that night. I don't like to think of her that way. My mom was something else. I miss her. I miss what I remember of her.
It begins with a sound that no one ever forgets. A sound that cuts through sleep like glass through skin, the unanswered ring of a phone at 2:17 a.m., echoing in a small California house where the lights are off and the windows are open to the warm night air. The call goes to voicemail. It always goes to voicemail after that night. By sunrise, the word missing is already moving faster than the morning traffic, whispered between neighbors, murmured into police radios, printed in black ink that feels too heavy for a single name. In 2005, this street looked ordinary. Trim lawns, parked cars cooling after long commutes, porch lights left on out of habit. But by the end of that week, it would be known by another label, one that never quite fades: cold case. The victim was the kind of person people describe using safe words: reliable, quiet, predictable. Someone who paid bills on time and waved without making eye contact. Someone who walked the same route every evening, who parked in the same spot, who locked the door with the same click of metal every night. That predictability would later be replayed like a curse, mapped out in timelines and reports, as if routine itself had become evidence. On the night they vanished, nothing appeared broken. No forced entry. No struggle visible to the naked eye. Just a car left where it shouldn't have been, angled slightly wrong, door closed but unlocked, as though whoever stepped out believed they would be right back. The house was silent when police arrived. Too silent. The air inside carried a faint, sour note. Something old, something nervous, something that didn't belong. Personal items sat exactly where they were expected to be. Wallet, keys, shoes by the door. A life paused mid-sentence. Investigators moved carefully, photographing corners, dusting surfaces, opening drawers with gloved hands, but the scene refused to give itself up. No blood. No weapon. No obvious explanation. Just absence. And absence, detectives would later admit, is the hardest thing to interrogate. By the second day, the neighborhood had become a stage. News vans lined the street. Microphones hovered like insects. Neighbors stepped forward, eager to be helpful, eager to be seen as helpful. They spoke about routines, about strange cars, about noises that might have been nothing. One woman mentioned a dog barking unusually late. A man down the block recalled headlights passing slowly, too slowly, around midnight. Every detail was logged, stacked, cross-referenced, but none of it connected. The pieces refused to lock together. Each lead dissolved on contact, leaving behind only more questions and the growing weight of a mystery that was already slipping out of reach. Detectives followed the usual paths first. Family, friends, co-workers, the ex who claimed they hadn't spoken in months, the boss who insisted everything was normal at work. Phones were checked, bank records examined, emails read line by line. There were no threats, no clear enemies, no secret debts waiting to explode. The victim did not fit the story people expected. There was no dramatic double life to uncover, no obvious motive lurking just beneath the surface. And that somehow made it worse. Crimes without reasons feel personal. They suggest randomness. They suggest that order itself is a lie. As the days stretched into weeks, the language changed. Missing became endangered. Endangered became presumed dead, though no one said it out loud. Candlelight vigils were held on the corner, flames trembling as if they understood the fragility of hope. Posters faded under the sun, their edges curling, faces becoming ghosts of ink and paper. Each night, someone left a porch light on a little longer than usual, an unspoken ritual that blended grief with superstition. The community waited for a break that never came. Inside the police department, the case thickened into binders. Tips flooded in, then slowed to a trickle. Psychics called. So did people seeking attention, confessing to crimes they could not possibly have committed. Detectives chased rumors through alleys and dead ends, through bars and storage units, through interviews that ended with shrugs and apologies. Somewhere along the way, the case stopped being urgent and started being old. That shift is subtle but deadly. Files are moved. Priorities change. New crimes demand new resources. The unsolved are boxed up and labeled, not abandoned but not alive either. The case entered the cold room where questions go to wait. Years passed. The street changed. New families moved in. Trees grew taller, casting longer shadows. The house at the center of it all sat occupied, then empty, then occupied again. Each new resident unaware of the silence soaked into the walls. The victim's name surfaced occasionally, usually around anniversaries, usually accompanied by the same grainy photo, and the same unanswered plea for information. Cold case. The phrase hardened with repetition, becoming less a description and more a verdict. Behind the scenes, however, the file never fully slept. Every so often, a detective would pull it down, flip through the pages, feel the familiar frustration rise again. Technology advanced. Databases expanded. Evidence that once seemed useless gained new potential. A partial print. A degraded sample. A timestamp that suddenly mattered. But even with these tools, the case resisted resolution. It was as if the truth had learned how to hide in plain sight. One detail, dismissed early on as insignificant, lingered like an aftertaste. A neighbor. Quiet. Polite. The kind of person who kept to themselves, who knew everyone's schedule without appearing to watch. They had spoken to police briefly in 2005, offered routine observations, nothing alarming. Their name appeared in the file, then vanished into the background noise of dozens of others. No criminal record. No obvious connection. Just proximity. And proximity without more is not guilt. It is merely geography. Time blurred motives and softened memories. Witnesses forgot exact hours. Alibis shifted subtly, unintentionally. What had once been sharp became rounded, unreliable. Investigators learned to distrust certainty, and to fear the spaces where memory should have been. The case lived on in fragments, a puzzle missing its picture, a question mark stamped over an entire year. Then quietly something changed. A review, a re-examination, a single piece of evidence looked at through a different lens. It did not scream. It whispered. A pattern emerged where there had only been coincidence. A timeline tightened. A gap closed. The quiet neighbor's name resurfaced, not as an afterthought, but as a line underlined twice. Still there was caution. Cold cases punish arrogance. Every step forward risked reopening wounds without delivering answers. Surveillance from a nearby intersection, once too grainy to matter, was enhanced. Movement became shape. Shape became suggestion. Not proof. Not yet. Investigators worked in silence, aware that premature attention could send the truth back into hiding. They traced routines again, this time overlapping them, layering one life over another until something didn't align. A walk that took too long. A car that returned too late. Small deviations that, alone, meant nothing but together began to hum with implication. The community sensed none of this. To them, the case was a relic, a tragedy from another time. Children who now rode bikes on that street had not been born when the victim disappeared. The past felt sealed. And that is when cold cases are most dangerous, when no one is watching, when the story feels finished even though it is not. Late one night, years after the unanswered phone call, a different sound broke the quiet. Boots on pavement. Radios crackling softly. The low murmur of coordination. A line of officers moved with purpose, stopping in front of a house that had never drawn attention. A house that blended perfectly into the dark. Inside, someone slept, unaware that the weight of 2005 was about to come crashing through the door. The raid would make headlines. The arrest would shock a community that thought it knew itself. But all of that came later. In this moment, as hands tightened on flashlights and warrants, as the past finally caught up with the present, one truth hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Cold cases do not die. They wait. And sometimes they wake up screaming. The door came apart in a single violent breath, with splintering inward as light flooded the hallway. And in that instant the quiet neighbor's life divided cleanly into before and after. Officers moved fast, voices sharp, commands overlapping. The kind of practiced chaos that leaves no room for misunderstanding. Hands were raised, wrists were bound, and somewhere deep in the house a clock kept ticking, stubbornly indifferent to the fact that a cold case stretching back to 2005 had just reached out and taken hold of the present. Outside, patrol cars idled with lights off, the street still asleep, unaware that history was being dragged out of a bedroom and into the open air. News broke at dawn. California 2005 cold case solved. Arrest made in midnight raid. The words hit like a blunt object, heavy and disorienting. Reporters scrambled. Phones rang in homes that had not thought about the disappearance in years. Former neighbors stopped mid-step, trying to reconcile the image in their heads with the headline on the screen. Quiet neighbor. The phrase repeated, incredulous, almost mocking. Quiet people are supposed to be safe. Quiet houses are supposed to hold nothing more dangerous than silence. Inside the police station, the suspects sat under fluorescent lights that revealed every line of their face. No outburst. No denial shouted in panic. Just a controlled stillness that unsettled even veteran detectives. This was not the behavior of someone caught off guard, they would later say. This was someone who had rehearsed the moment, who had lived alongside the possibility of it for years. The interview room door closed with a soft click, and the weight of 2 decades pressed down on the table between them. Investigators began at the beginning, because cold cases demand ritual. Names. Dates. Where were you in 2005? What did you see? Who did you know? The suspect answered calmly, sometimes too calmly, their voice steady as they described a life that appeared unremarkable. Work. Home. Routine. It was the same story they had told before years ago, when the disappearance was fresh and the questions were few. But time had changed the questions. Time had sharpened them. They slid a photograph across the table. A still frame pulled from enhanced footage, once useless, now painfully clear. A vehicle. A silhouette. A moment frozen just long enough to matter. The suspect glanced at it, expression barely shifting, but something tightened behind the eyes. Detectives noticed. They always do. Silence stretched, not empty but loaded, the kind that demands attention. When the suspect finally spoke, it was to correct a detail no one had asked about. That too was noticed. Outside the room, evidence was being unpacked like a confession in slow motion. Items collected during the raid. Clothing carefully sealed in bags. Tools that did not belong to the house, stored in places that suggested secrecy rather than forgetfulness. Forensic teams worked methodically, aware that the margin for error was gone. A solved cold case is fragile. One misstep can turn certainty back into speculation. They returned to the street where it all began, not as responders this time, but as historians. Every house was a footnote. Every driveway a paragraph. The victim's final movements were replayed against the backdrop of what was now known. The unlocked car. The angled parking. The sense of interruption. It no longer looked random. It looked planned. Opportunistic, yes, but not accidental. The neighbor's schedule overlaid perfectly. A shadow matching shape and length. Proximity had become opportunity. Opportunity had become action. The community reacted in waves. Shock gave way to disbelief. Disbelief hardened into anger. People remembered conversations that now felt contaminated, smiles that seemed rehearsed, small kindnesses that curdled under scrutiny. Someone recalled borrowing a tool. Another remembered a late-night knock, brushed off at the time as nothing. Memory once dormant, rushed back with force, rearranging itself to accommodate a truth no one wanted. This was not a monster from outside. This was someone who had always been there. In the interview room, the tone shifted. Detectives stopped asking and started presenting. Timelines were laid out, gaps circled in red. Cell tower data placed the suspect where they claimed not to be. A purchase receipt surfaced, mundane on its own, devastating in context. The suspect listened, head tilted slightly, as though evaluating a performance. When they finally spoke, it was to accuse the police of forcing a narrative, of seeing patterns where none existed. The words were familiar. The confidence less so. What broke through was not confrontation but inevitability. A piece of physical evidence, preserved and revisited, finally spoke with authority. It did not shout. It did not dramatize. It simply matched. Against all odds, against time and degradation and doubt, it matched. The suspect's composure cracked, just enough to let something raw show through. Fear not of punishment but of exposure. The fear of being known. As the hours wore on, the story began to leak out in fragments. Not a full confession but admissions wrapped in deflection. Yes, they had been nearby. Yes, they had seen the victim that night. Yes, there had been an argument, brief, inconsequential, easily forgotten. Every yes was a step closer, every qualifier an attempt to slow the fall. Detectives let the silence do its work. Silence is patient. Silence remembers. The victim's family was notified in a room designed for grief. Words were chosen carefully, delivered softly. But there is no gentle way to say that a mystery has ended with violence. Relief collided with pain, closure tangled with rage. They had lived for years inside a question mark, and now it had been replaced with a period that felt far too final. The name of the suspect was spoken aloud, and with it came a new kind of loss, the loss of not knowing sooner, of not seeing what was, in hindsight, hiding in plain sight. Media coverage intensified. Old footage resurfaced. Reporters stood on the same sidewalks, repeating the same lines, but now the tone had changed. This was no longer a plea for answers. This was an autopsy of time itself, an examination of how a crime can breathe quietly for years without being detected. Commentators asked how it could happen. Experts spoke about missed signs, about the psychology of offenders who blend seamlessly into their surroundings. The phrase cold case echoed through it all, stripped now of its distance, warmed by resolution. Yet even as the case moved toward courtrooms and filings, something lingered unresolved. The full truth remained just out of reach, obscured by half-answers and calculated silence. Where exactly had the victim been taken? What final moments had looked like? Whether remorse had ever entered the picture? These details mattered not for conviction but for understanding. And understanding in cases like this is often denied. The quiet neighbor was transferred to a holding cell, then to a facility where the walls remember screams. The house was taped off, searched again, photographed from every angle. It would eventually be cleaned, sold, occupied by someone new, but it would never be just a house again. It had become a punctuation mark in the story of a street, a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with noise. As night fell, lights flicked on across the neighborhood. People stood at windows longer than usual, watching shadows move, listening to familiar sounds with unfamiliar suspicion. The cold case was solved, the headlines said, but the cold had not left. It had merely changed shape, settling into the spaces between neighbors, into the questions parents would now ask themselves as they locked their doors. In the end, the most unsettling truth was not how the case was solved, but how long it took. 20 years of ordinary days, of shared sidewalks and passing hellos, while the answer lived next door. The arrest closed the file, but it opened something else entirely. a realization that some mysteries are not hidden in darkness, but illuminated by routine, waiting for someone brave or patient enough to look again. The first court appearance did not feel like justice. It felt like theater stripped of comfort. The suspect entered in cuffs, expression neutral, shoulders squared, as if posture alone could hold back the years now pressing in. Cameras clicked, whispers rippled, and the room settled into a tense stillness that carried the weight of every unanswered question from 2005. The charge was read aloud, the words precise and unforgiving, and for a moment the timeline collapsed, the past standing shoulder to shoulder with the present, demanding to be acknowledged. Prosecutors spoke carefully, aware that cold cases live and die by credibility. They outlined a narrative that had taken 2 decades to assemble, a story built not on a single explosive revelation, but on the slow accumulation of facts that refused to remain silent. They described routine as camouflage, proximity as access, patience as strategy. They avoided sensational language, letting the evidence do what evidence does best, suggest inevitability. The defense listened, already preparing to carve doubt out of every gap, every delay, every memory softened by time. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered again, older now, marked by years that had carried the case like a low-grade fever. Some faces were familiar from old news clips. Others belonged to people who had only inherited the story secondhand. They spoke in hushed tones about trust, about how easily assumptions settle in and become shields. Someone said they had always felt something was off. Someone else admitted they had never suspected a thing. Both statements hung in the air, equally true, equally useless. Investigators returned to the evidence with renewed urgency, not to find guilt, but to protect it. Cold cases are vulnerable to erosion, to the argument that time itself is reasonable doubt. Every item was catalogued again, every chain of custody reviewed, every decision justified. The smallest mistake could reopen the wound, could turn a solved case back into a cautionary tale about what happens when patience runs out before truth arrives. They focused on the moments after the disappearance, the thin slice of time where opportunity becomes action. Witness statements were re-examined not for what they said but for what they avoided. Pause before an answer. A correction offered too quickly. Patterns emerged that had once been invisible, hidden by the noise of an active investigation. Now, with the benefit of distance, those patterns stood out, sharp and undeniable. The suspect's behavior under scrutiny became its own kind of evidence. Jailhouse recordings captured fragments of conversation, carefully parsed for slips, for unintended admissions. Letters were written, then rewritten, words crossed out, phrases softened. There was no dramatic confession, no cinematic collapse. Instead, there was control, measured, deliberate, the control of someone who believed that restraint could still outpace consequence. But control leaves marks. It reveals priorities. It shows what a person is willing to concede and what they will never touch. The victim's life was reconstructed not to sensationalize, but to humanize. Prosecutors spoke of habits, of small preferences, of plans interrupted. They described a person defined not by how they died, but by how they lived, insisting that the absence left behind had a shape, a gravity. Friends testified about missed birthdays, about empty chairs at holidays, about the slow erosion of hope that comes from waiting without answers. Each testimony tightened the narrative, grounding it in loss rather than speculation. Forensic experts took the stand, explaining technology that did not exist in 2005, methods refined through years of trial and error. They spoke about probability, about matches that narrow the world until coincidence is no longer a viable explanation. The defense pushed back, highlighting contamination risks, degradation, the simple fact that time complicates everything. The courtroom absorbed it all, a clash between certainty and skepticism, both sharpened by the stakes. As the trial unfolded, the media revisited old footage, juxtaposing it with the present. The contrast was jarring. Younger faces, simpler questions. The same street, the same houses, unchanged on the surface. Commentators spoke about how cold cases challenge our faith in closure, how resolution can arrive too late to feel like relief. They asked whether justice delayed is justice denied, or whether it is simply justice forced to wait for the right moment to breathe. The suspect remained mostly silent, advised by counsel, insulated by procedure. When they did speak, it was to deny intent, to reframe events as misunderstandings layered with misfortune. The story shifted subtly like sand underfoot, never settling long enough to be pinned down. Detectives watched from the gallery, recognizing the tactics, understanding the psychology. They had seen this before. They knew that truth does not always arrive in a single piece. Behind closed doors, prosecutors debated strategy late into the night. How much to reveal? When to reveal it? Which evidence to hold until doubt grew restless? Cold cases reward patience, but trials demand momentum. The balance was delicate. Push too hard and the narrative could fracture. Hold back too much and the jury could drift. Every decision was measured against the memory of a night in 2005, when nothing seemed urgent until it was too late. The neighborhood itself became a witness, its collective memory dissected and displayed. Maps were shown, sightlines traced, distances measured in steps and seconds. The idea that something so violent could unfold in such a familiar place unsettled everyone who listened. It challenged the comfort of routine, the assumption that danger announces itself loudly. Instead, it suggested that silence can be an accomplice. As weeks passed, fatigue set in. Trials wear down not just participants but observers. Attention wavers, the extraordinary risks becoming procedural. And yet at key moments the weight returned sudden and heavy. A photograph, a timestamp, a voice recording played one more time. Each reminder pulled the room back to the core truth. Someone had vanished and someone else knew why. When closing arguments approached, the tone shifted again. Prosecutors spoke of patience rewarded, of a community that refused to forget. They framed the case not as a miracle, but as a testament to persistence, to the idea that answers can survive neglect. The defense countered with uncertainty, with the dangers of reconstructing the past through a modern lens. They warned against the seduction of narrative, against mistaking coherence for truth. The jury retreated to deliberate, carrying with them years compressed into binders and hours of testimony. Outside, the world waited, suspended in a familiar tension. Cold cases do not end cleanly. They linger, even as decisions are made, leaving behind a residue of doubt and reflection. The question was no longer whether the case was solved, but whether resolution could ever fully repair what time had taken. As night fell on the courthouse, lights burned in windows across the city. Somewhere a street returned to quiet, cars parked neatly, doors locked with familiar clicks. But the silence was different now, informed by knowledge, shaped by a truth that had taken too long to surface. The cold case had been pulled into the light, examined, argued over, but its shadow remained, stretching backward and forward, a reminder that some answers arrive only after they have learned how to hurt. The verdict did not arrive with drama, it arrived with gravity. The jury filed back into the room, faces set, movements deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of years they had not personally lived but were now responsible for judging. When the decision was read, the words fell flat and heavy, not explosive, not triumphant. Guilty. A single word that closed a legal argument, while opening an emotional vacuum no one knew how to fill. The quiet neighbor stood still, absorbing it without visible reaction, as though the outcome had been filed away long ago. Prepared for, rehearsed, survived in imagination 1,000 times before this moment ever came. There was no celebration. Justice in cold cases is never loud. The victim's family wept, but not with relief alone. Their grief had matured over 2 decades, layered with anniversaries, with unanswered holidays, with the slow acceptance that certainty might never come. Now it had arrived, late and sharp, reopening wounds that had scarred imperfectly. Closure was the word reporters used, but closure implied a door gently shut. This felt more like a door ripped open, exposing a room no one had entered in years, the air inside stale and painful to breathe. Sentencing loomed, another procedural mountain to climb. Prosecutors argued for severity, emphasizing duration as cruelty. The years stolen not only from the victim but from everyone who loved them. They spoke about how the crime had continued long after the act itself, sustained by silence, by the daily decision not to tell the truth. The defense asked for restraint, citing age, mental state, the absence of prior convictions. They framed the past as distant, as though distance could dilute responsibility. The judge listened, unmoved by rhetoric, guided instead by a timeline that refused to forget. When the sentence was handed down, it felt inevitable rather than satisfying. The quiet neighbor was led away, disappearing through a door that closed with the same unremarkable sound as any other, a click that echoed strangely in the room. Outside, cameras captured reactions, but even the most seasoned reporters struggled to narrate what this moment meant. How do you quantify justice delayed by 20 years? How do you measure accountability against time that cannot be returned? In the weeks that followed, the story did not fade as quickly as others do. Commentators dug deeper, less interested now in the crime itself than in its invisibility. They examined how someone could commit violence and then dissolve back into routine, how communities learn to normalize absence when answers do not arrive on schedule. Psychologists spoke about compartmentalization, about offenders who build lives around secrets like load-bearing walls. Remove them too quickly, and the entire structure collapses. The house was sold quietly. Fresh paint covered old walls. New owners moved in, unaware at first of the history attached to their address. When they learned, as they inevitably did, they stood in each room, listening for echoes that were no longer there. Places absorb stories whether they want to or not. The street adjusted slowly, conversations cautious, glances lingering a second longer than before. Trust does not break all at once. It fractures, hairline cracks spreading outward, visible only when the light hits just right. For detectives, the case brought neither triumph nor peace. Solving it had not erased the years spent circling the truth, the nights replaying decisions, wondering what could have been done differently. They revisited old reports, seeing now the moments where instinct had whispered and procedure had prevailed. Cold cases teach humility. They remind investigators that certainty is fragile, that timing can be as decisive as evidence. The resolution became a case study, taught to new recruits not as a victory lap, but as a warning. The victim's name returned to headlines one last time, paired with words like justice and resolution, but those who knew them best understood that the story would never be complete. There were details the quiet neighbor had taken with them into silence, pieces of the narrative that would never be articulated, no matter how many questions were asked. The truth had limits, and those limits were now permanent. Community forums were held, ostensibly to heal, but also to understand. People asked how to spot warning signs, how to reconcile neighborliness with vigilance. Experts answered carefully, resisting the urge to offer false comfort. They spoke about probabilities, about how rare such cases are, and yet how devastating they become precisely because of that rarity. The message was unsettling but honest. You cannot always know. Sometimes the danger is not loud. Sometimes it is polite, punctual, and invisible. As months passed, the case settled into history. Files were archived, evidence stored, headlines replaced by newer tragedies. But the cold case had altered something fundamental. It had reminded the community that time is not an eraser. It is a container. It holds truths until they are ready to surface, whether anyone is prepared for them or not. On quiet evenings, when the street returned to its old rhythms, some residents found themselves replaying the past unconsciously. The night of the disappearance, the years of waiting, the shock of the arrest. They realized that memory, like justice, does not move in straight lines. It loops. It revisits. It insists on being acknowledged. The California 2005 cold case was solved, the records now state, but solved does not mean settled. It means defined. It means named. It means the question mark has been replaced with a sentence that can be read aloud, even if it still hurts to hear. The quiet neighbor is gone, the victim finally spoken for by a system that arrived late but arrived nonetheless. And yet, long after the courtrooms emptied and the cameras packed up, something remained. A lingering awareness that the past is never as distant as it seems, that answers can live next door, unrecognized for years. The case closed on paper, but in the minds of those who lived through it, it stayed open, a reminder etched into routine. Cold cases do not end when the verdict is read. They end when the silence they create finally loses its power. And even then, the echo can last a lifetime. Years after the verdict, the case still refused to lie flat. It surfaced in conversations that began about something else entirely, in documentaries pitched as retrospectives, in late-night radio segments where callers spoke softly, as if afraid of waking something that should remain asleep. The California 2005 cold case had become more than a solved crime. It had turned into a reference point, a shorthand for how ordinary life can fracture without warning and then continue, stitched together imperfectly, carrying the scar beneath the surface. The victim's absence was no longer a mystery, but it was still an ache. Their name appeared on a plaque engraved cleanly, dates precise, but the space between those dates felt too narrow to contain everything that had been lost. Family members learned to navigate a new version of grief, one complicated by answers that arrived late. They spoke about how uncertainty had once been a shield, how hope, however painful, had at least allowed imagination to soften the edges. Now imagination had been replaced by facts, and facts are sharp. They cut in ways that questions never could. For the community, the trial's end marked the beginning of an uneasy self-examination. People replayed old interactions, searching for missed signals, for moments that might have meant something if only they had been read differently. A wave of suspicion followed, subtle but pervasive. Doors were locked sooner. Trust was rationed. The idea that safety could be assumed had been quietly dismantled, replaced with a more fragile understanding that security is conditional, dependent not just on environment but on people, and people are unknowable. Law enforcement agencies studied the case obsessively. Conferences dissected it. Panels debated it. The California 2005 cold case was cited as an example of persistence rewarded, but also of opportunity lost. Analysts pointed to early decisions, to resource constraints, to the natural human tendency to prioritize the urgent over the unresolved. They spoke about how cold cases cool not because they lack heat but because attention drifts. The lesson was uncomfortable. Resolution often requires not brilliance but endurance. Detectives involved in the original investigation carried the case with them into retirement. Some admitted they had thought about it weekly, others monthly, others only when triggered by something small, a familiar street, a certain time of night, the sound of a phone ringing unanswered. Solving it did not erase those years of wondering, simply reframed them. The question shifted from what happened to why it took so long to see what had been there all along. The quiet neighbor, now reduced to a number in a system built for containment, became the subject of endless speculation. Psychologists analyzed their behavior, their ability to blend, to maintain routine without visible cracks. They talked about compartmentalization, about the mind's capacity to seal off acts from identity. The conclusion was never comforting. There was no singular trait to watch for, no reliable tell. The most unsettling truth was that normalcy is not proof of innocence, and abnormality is not proof of guilt. The world does not offer clean categories. Media narratives shifted tone over time. Early coverage had been breathless, focused on shock and revelation. Later pieces grew quieter, more reflective. Journalists ask different questions now. What does justice mean when it arrives decades late? Who bears responsibility for the years of silence? Can a community ever fully reclaim its sense of itself after learning how wrong it was? The answers varied, but the discomfort was consistent. Anniversaries came and went, marked by brief mentions, then eventually by silence. New crimes demanded attention. New tragedies rewrote the headlines. The solved cold case slid back into the archive of collective memory, not forgotten but no longer dominant. And yet its influence lingered. It changed how people consumed news, how they reacted to missing person alerts, how they interpreted the phrase quiet neighbor when it appeared in a story. Language itself had been altered, words carrying extra weight they hadn't before. In private moments, the victim's family confronted a different kind of reckoning. They had spent years imagining multiple endings, some miraculous, some devastating. The truth had chosen one path and closed the others forever. They spoke about forgiveness carefully, not as absolution but as a tool for survival. Forgiveness, they learned, was not about the person who caused harm. It was about releasing the grip that harm maintained long after the threat was gone. The physical spaces tied to the case continued their quiet evolution. The street looked the same to outsiders, indistinguishable from countless others across California. But for those who knew, it carried an extra dimension, an invisible layer of history. Certain houses were passed with quicker steps. Certain corners invited pause. Geography had been rewritten by memory, transformed into a map of before and after. Educational programs for investigators began using the case to illustrate the importance of re-examination. Students were taught not to revere initial conclusions, not to confuse early confidence with truth. The case demonstrated how evidence can wait patiently, how technology can unlock voices long thought lost. It also showed how humility is as critical to justice as intelligence. The idea that someone might have been overlooked not out of malice, but out of assumption, resonated deeply. For all its analysis, the case resisted final interpretation. There were still moments unaccounted for, still questions answered only partially. This incompleteness became part of its legacy. It reminded people that even solved cases can leave loose ends, that the human need for total understanding is rarely satisfied. The narrative had an ending but not a perfect one. Late at night, when the world quieted and distractions thinned, the story sometimes returned uninvited. A memory of the unanswered phone call, the image of a street bathed in flashing lights, the shock of realizing that danger had worn a familiar face. These moments were fleeting but potent, evidence that the case had embedded itself not just in records, but in consciousness. The California 2005 cold case no longer demanded action, but it demanded remembrance. It asked those who encountered it to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge that certainty is often a luxury afforded only in hindsight. It challenged the comforting belief that time heals all wounds, offering instead a more complicated truth. Time reveals, and revelation can hurt as much as it helps. In the end, the case became a mirror. It reflected the limits of systems, the patience of truth, the fragility of trust. It showed how lives can intersect briefly and catastrophically, then diverge for years before colliding again in a courtroom under fluorescent lights. The file was closed. The sentence was served. But the story, once released into the world, continued to move, carried forward by those who had lived it, studied it, or simply heard it and felt something shift. Cold cases are often described as frozen in time, but this one proved the opposite. It moved slowly, invisibly through decades, reshaping everything it touched. And even now, long after the headlines faded, it remained a quiet presence, a reminder that answers do not always come when they are needed, only when they are ready to be seen. Time did what it always does after a case is closed. It moved forward without asking permission. New families arrived. Old ones left. The rhythm of the street normalized, at least on the surface, but beneath it ran a current altered permanently by what had been revealed. The California 2005 cold case had settled into the background noise of life, no longer screaming for attention, yet never fully silent. It existed in the way people glanced twice at unfamiliar cars, in the way porch lights stayed on a little longer, in the way conversations paused when someone mentioned the word neighbor. For the victim's family, life reorganized itself around a truth that no longer shifted. They no longer waited for updates or calls, no longer braced themselves for false hope. Instead, they learned to live with a fixed outcome, a reality that could not be negotiated or reimagined. There was comfort in that finality, but also a stark emptiness. Hope, they discovered, is painful, but certainty has its own weight. It leaves no room to hide. They returned to old places occasionally, not out of nostalgia, but out of a need to confront what remained. A park bench, a grocery store aisle, a stretch of road driven countless times before 2005. Each location carried echoes, not audible but unmistakable. Memory layered itself over the present, turning ordinary moments into quiet confrontations with the past. Healing was not linear. Some days felt almost normal. Others collapsed under the simplest reminder. A date on a calendar, a familiar song, the sound of a phone ringing late at night. Within law enforcement, the case continued to ripple outward. Younger detectives, who had not even joined the force when the disappearance occurred, studied it as both inspiration and warning. They learned how easily assumptions harden, how routine can dull curiosity. The quiet neighbor became a cautionary archetype, not as a monster, but as a reminder that crime does not always announce itself through chaos. Sometimes it slips into the background, hiding behind predictability and patience. Internal reviews led to subtle changes. Cold case units received renewed attention. Old evidence was digitized, cross-referenced, made searchable in ways that would have seemed impossible in 2005. The philosophy shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly, from reactive to reflective. Investigators were encouraged to revisit, to doubt their own conclusions, to treat unanswered questions not as failures but as unfinished conversations. The California 2005 cold case had taught them that truth does not expire. The quiet neighbor's name, once spoken in whispers, faded into institutional language. Inmate, defendant, Convicted. The human details were reduced to forms and schedules, visitation logs, and court documents. Outside interest waned as it always does, but inside the system, the individual became another case number moving through a structure designed for permanence. There was no redemption arc, no dramatic unraveling, just the slow grind of consequence. Psychologists continued to debate the case, not because it defied explanation, but because it resisted simplification. There was no single trauma to point to, no moment that clearly marked the beginning. The narrative refused to offer comfort in the form of causation. Instead, it suggested something more disturbing, that some acts are not the result of visible breakdowns, but of decisions made quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. The absence of spectacle made it harder to digest, harder to warn against. Media attention returned sporadically, often triggered by anniversaries or by similar cases elsewhere. Each time the story was retold with slight variations, emphasis shifting based on cultural mood. Sometimes it was about forensic breakthroughs, other times about community blindness. Occasionally, it became a meditation on patience, on the idea that justice can be slow without being absent. But no retelling could capture the full texture of living through it, of carrying unanswered questions for years, and then being asked to set them down. The street itself became an object of quiet fascination. People drove through it slowly, noticing how unremarkable it looked. No landmarks, no markers, just a place where something irreversible had happened and then been hidden by time. Residents learned to answer questions from outsiders with practiced neutrality, offering facts without emotion. They had learned that too much feeling invited speculation, and speculation reopened wounds they preferred to keep scarred over. Children who grew up there heard fragments of the story, usually secondhand, filtered through adult caution. They understood that something bad had happened, that it involved someone who seemed normal. That lesson settled early, shaping their understanding of safety and trust in ways they could not articulate. Trauma, even indirect, has a way of teaching without announcing itself. The victim's legacy evolved quietly. Scholarships were established. Charities mentioned their name. Acts of remembrance took forms that did not require public spectacle. These gestures did not erase the loss, but they reframed it, allowing something constructive to grow from absence. The family found meaning not in the crime, but in the response to it, in the choice to keep moving despite the weight of what had been taken. Behind closed doors, some investigators revisited moments they could not stop replaying. The early interview with the neighbor, the details dismissed as trivial, the instincts noted and then overridden. They did not frame these thoughts as regrets, but as lessons paid for dearly. Cold cases demand accountability not just from perpetrators, but from systems that must learn from their own blind spots. As technology continued to advance, new tools emerged that promised to shrink the future gap between crime and resolution. Algorithms, databases, predictive models. And yet, the California 2005 cold case remained a reminder that tools are only as effective as the questions they are used to ask. Data can illuminate, but curiosity must guide it. Without that, even the most advanced systems can overlook what is standing directly in front of them. The community slowly reclaimed rituals that had been suspended. Block parties returned. Children played later into the evening. Laughter became less guarded. These were not declarations of healing, but signs of resilience. Life insists on continuation, even in the aftermath of revelation. The street learned how to hold both memory and motion at the same time. And still, in quiet moments, the case resurfaced uninvited. A news alert about a missing person elsewhere. A documentary trailer promising answers. Each instance triggered a brief tightening in the chest, a reminder that what happened here was not unique, only personal. The solved cold case became a lens through which other mysteries were viewed, each one carrying the potential to follow the same long, silent path. The most enduring impact of the California 2005 cold case was not fear, but awareness. An understanding that certainty is provisional, that safety is constructed daily, not assumed. It taught that questions should not be abandoned simply because time has passed. If anything, time can sharpen them. As years continued to accumulate, the case shifted fully into history, studied rather than lived. But history, unlike memory, does not fade. It waits, recorded and ready, for the next person willing to listen closely. The cold case had done its work not just by being solved, but by leaving behind a changed landscape of thought, a quiet insistence that truth, however patient, will eventually demand to be acknowledged. And in that insistence lay the final echo of 2005. Not a scream, not a headline, but a steady reminder that silence is never empty, and that what goes unanswered today may still be speaking, waiting for the moment when someone is finally prepared to hear it. The case entered textbooks before it ever found peace. Criminal justice programs cited it in chapters about delayed resolution, about the thin line between oversight and inevitability. Students read about the California 2005 cold case as though it were a controlled scenario, a lesson contained neatly between margins. But those who had lived through it knew better. They understood that the real costs could not be summarized, that the years spent waiting had reshaped identities, altered futures, and left behind a quiet exhaustion no verdict could undo. For the victim's family, the passage of time softened nothing, it clarified. They no longer measured their lives against what might have been. Instead, they acknowledged what was irrevocably gone and focused on what remained within reach. Some relationships grew stronger, forged by shared endurance. Others fractured under the strain, unable to reconcile different ways of coping. Grief, they learned, is not uniform. It adapts, it mutates, and sometimes it contradicts itself. Public memory shifted as well. The initial shock that followed the arrest and conviction gave way to a quieter, more reflective awareness. The phrase quiet neighbor stopped being shorthand for betrayal and became a reminder of how limited perception can be. People spoke less about the individual and more about the conditions that allowed the crime to remain hidden. The emphasis moved from blame to understanding, from outrage to vigilance. Law enforcement agencies across the state quietly restructured how they approached unresolved cases. Resources were allocated not in bursts, but in sustained cycles. Cold cases were no longer treated as archival responsibilities, but as living investigations paused by circumstance rather than by failure. The California 2005 cold case had demonstrated that persistence, not pressure, was the variable most often missing. Technology continued to accelerate, offering new ways to interrogate old evidence. Genetic databases expanded, analytical software improved, yet the case remained a reminder that technology is only as decisive as the human willingness to return to difficult questions. The most critical breakthrough had not come from a machine, but from a decision to look again, to challenge assumptions that had calcified over time. The street where it all began found its own equilibrium. Residents learned to live with the knowledge that history does not evacuate when a story concludes. It lingers embedded in sidewalks and sightlines. Newcomers were told the story when they had lived there long enough to understand it, not as a warning but as context. The past, they were taught, is part of the property, even if it is not listed on the deed. Children who grew up in the shadow of the case carried its lessons differently. For them, the story was not about shock but about consequence. They understood that actions can echo for decades, that silence can be a form of harm, and that truth has a way of resurfacing regardless of how deeply it is buried. These lessons were absorbed quietly, without ceremony, shaping their sense of the world in subtle but enduring ways. Media portrayals matured. Early dramatizations, heavy on suspense and revelation, gradually gave way to more restrained accounts. Filmmakers focused less on the crime and more on the wait. The long stretch of not knowing became the central narrative, an exploration of how uncertainty seeps into daily life and alters it from the inside. Viewers responded not with thrills, but with recognition. Many had their own unanswered questions, their own private cold cases. The quiet neighbor, now far removed from public consciousness, existed mostly in academic analysis and legal documentation. Their name appeared in footnotes and citations, stripped of personal detail. This reduction was intentional. Attention shifted away from the perpetrator and toward the system that had allowed the crime to remain unresolved for so long. The story became less about one person's actions and more about collective responsibility. For investigators, the case marked a turning point in professional identity. Those who had worked on it spoke openly about uncertainty, about the danger of mistaking closure for understanding. They mentored younger colleagues with an emphasis on curiosity over confidence. The California 2005 cold case had taught them that answers rarely arrive on schedule, and that patience, while often undervalued, is a critical investigative tool. Commemorations grew quieter over time. No large gatherings. No dramatic speeches. Just small acts of remembrance that honored the victim without reopening wounds.
À Candeli privately.
A donation made anonymously. These gestures reflected an understanding that healing does not require performance. It requires space. As years continued to pass, the case settled into a kind of equilibrium, neither forgotten nor constantly revisited. It became part of the background knowledge of the region, a story known but not always spoken. And yet, when new cases emerged, when headlines mentioned missing persons or delayed arrests, the old narrative resurfaced instinctively, informing reactions and expectations. The most profound shift was internal. People learned to live with ambiguity without surrendering to it. They accepted that not all questions are answered quickly, but they rejected the idea that unanswered questions should be abandoned. The solved cold case reinforced a simple, unsettling truth. Time does not invalidate inquiry. It intensifies it. In professional circles, the case was often summarized as a success, but those closest to it resisted that label. Success implies efficiency, and there was nothing efficient about waiting 20 years for answers. Instead, they spoke of persistence, of refusal. The refusal to let a name fade completely. The refusal to accept silence as resolution. As the narrative aged, it gained a different kind of power. No longer driven by shock, it operated through quiet influence. It shaped policy discussions, informed investigative priorities, and altered how communities thought about safety and trust. The California 2005 cold case had moved beyond its origin, becoming a lens rather than a headline. In the end, what endured was not the crime itself, but the lesson it carried forward. That truth can be patient. That ordinary appearances are not guarantees. That justice, while imperfect and often late, can still arrive with enough force to change how the future is approached. The story no longer demanded attention. It commanded respect. And in that respect lay its final lasting impact, a reminder that even when silence stretches for years, it is never the final word. By the time the case reached its 20th anniversary, it no longer belonged to the present. It existed in a separate layer of time, one accessed through archives, interviews, and the careful retelling of events that had long since stopped unfolding. The California 2005 cold case had become a fixed point, a reference that shaped how new mysteries were understood. It was invoked not to shock, but to caution, a reminder that some truths arrive only after patience has been exhausted. The anniversary passed without ceremony. No press conference. No official statements. Just a handful of articles noting the date, their tone subdued, almost apologetic. The lack of spectacle felt appropriate. This was not a story that benefited from repetition. It was one that asked for reflection, for an understanding that repetition itself can sometimes be a form of harm. In classrooms and training rooms, the case was discussed with a new emphasis. Instructors focused less on the breakthrough and more on the delay. Students were asked uncomfortable questions. What assumptions guided the early investigation? Which voices were prioritized? Which were discounted? The exercise was not about assigning blame, but about recognizing patterns that repeat quietly across jurisdictions and years. The cold case served as a mirror, reflecting the habits that allow silence to persist. For the victim's family, anniversaries were complicated. They no longer marked the disappearance or the arrest. They marked endurance. Each year represented another cycle survived, another period navigated without the person who should have been there. The truth had answered some questions, but it had not restored what was lost. Acceptance, they learned, was not a destination. It was a practice. The neighborhood rarely spoke about the case openly anymore. When it did surface, it was usually in response to something else. A new missing person alert, a sudden police presence elsewhere. The story emerged not as gossip but as context. A quiet acknowledgement that something similar had happened here once, and that it had taken years to understand. The lesson lingered without being rehearsed. Psychological studies continued to reference the case, particularly in discussions about delayed accountability. Researchers explored how perpetrators manage long periods of normalcy after committing violent acts, how they integrate secrecy into routine. The findings offered insight but no reassurance. The capacity to compartmentalize, to function without visible distress, proved disturbingly common. The case underscored a reality many preferred to ignore. Danger does not always disrupt behavior. Sometimes it adapts. Within the justice system, the case influenced policy in subtle ways. Guidelines for evidence preservation were strengthened. Protocols for periodic review of unresolved cases were formalized. These changes were incremental, not dramatic, but they mattered. They represented an institutional acknowledgement that time alone should not decide which questions deserve attention. The quiet neighbor's story faded further into abstraction. They were no longer a person in public discourse but an example, a reference in footnotes and lectures. This erasure was deliberate. Attention shifted away from the individual act and toward the structural conditions that had allowed it to remain hidden. The narrative matured, shedding its early fixation on shock in favor of analysis. For those who had lived nearby in 2005, memory played tricks. Some details sharpened over time, others blurred beyond recovery. The human mind, seeking coherence, rearranged events, smoothing inconsistencies, filling gaps. People learned to distrust their own certainty, to recognize that recollection is not evidence. This humility, hard-earned, became one of the case's quieter legacies. Media interest now arrived in waves, often tied to broader conversations about justice reform or forensic innovation. When the case was mentioned, it was as part of a pattern, not an anomaly. The story contributed to a growing awareness that delayed resolution is not failure, but neither is it acceptable. The tension between patience and urgency remained unresolved, a question without a definitive answer. The physical evidence, preserved meticulously, sat in controlled environments, labeled and logged. It no longer served an investigative purpose, but it remained a testament to endurance. Each item represented a moment rescued from decay, a refusal to let time erase what mattered. The evidence had outlived doubt, and in doing so, it had reshaped expectations. The victim's legacy continued quietly. Their name appeared in annual reports, in scholarship acknowledgments, in the memory of those who had known them personally. These mentions were not dramatic, but they were consistent. They ensured that the person at the center of the case was not reduced to a statistic or a lesson. They remained human, specific, irreplaceable. As new cases emerged, some unsolved, some resolved quickly, comparisons were inevitable. Investigators asked themselves what this case would have looked like under different circumstances. Would earlier technology have changed the outcome? Would a different allocation of resources have shortened the wait? These questions had no answers, but asking them kept the system restless, resistant to complacency. The cold case also altered how communities interpreted silence. A lack of information was no longer assumed to mean a lack of effort. People became more aware of the slow, often invisible work behind investigations. This awareness did not eliminate frustration, but it tempered it, replacing anger with cautious expectation. Over time, the case became less about what happened and more about what it revealed. It exposed the patience of truth, the fragility of memory, and the danger of assumption. It demonstrated that resolution, while essential, does not undo the past, simply redefines it. As the years stretched further from 2005, the story receded into the background of collective memory, not forgotten but settled. It occupied a quiet space, accessible when needed, instructive when revisited. The California 2005 cold case had completed its transformation from event to lesson, from shock to structure. And in that transformation lay its enduring significance. Not as a tale of triumph or failure, but as a reminder that justice is not a moment. It is a process, uneven and often uncomfortable, that demands persistence long after attention has moved on. Silence may stretch, but it does not close the record. It only waits for someone willing to read it again. The years continued their quiet accumulation, stacking one on top of another until distance itself became deceptive. 2 decades felt both impossibly long and strangely compressed, as if time had folded inward around the California 2005 cold case, preserving it in a permanent state of relevance. It was no longer discussed as news but as precedent. Not a headline, but a reference point invoked whenever patience was tested and doubt threatened to eclipse persistence. For investigators still active in the field, the case lived on in muscle memory. It surfaced during briefings, in the pauses between sentences when someone hesitated before dismissing a lead as unlikely. The lesson was unspoken but understood. Unlikely is not impossible, and impossible is often just unexplored. Younger officers learned to read the room when veterans mentioned 2005, sensing that the date carried weight beyond its numbers. It represented a failure to see clearly, followed by a refusal to stop looking. The victim's family experienced time differently. For them, each passing year did not create distance. It created layers. The initial shock, the long uncertainty, the eventual resolution. All of it coexisted, accessible at any moment. They learned to live with overlapping emotions, to accept that grief does not move forward so much as it expands. Even with answers, even with accountability, there were moments when the absence felt as raw as it had in the beginning. They spoke less publicly now, not out of avoidance but out of protection. Their story had been told enough times to strangers who consumed it briefly and then moved on. Privacy became a form of healing, a way to reclaim parts of life that had been suspended for years. They honored the memory quietly, intentionally, resisting the pull to turn loss into spectacle. Within academic circles, the case inspired debates that extended beyond criminal justice. Sociologists examined the community response, the gradual normalization of absence, the way uncertainty reshapes social bonds. They noted how neighborhoods adapt to unresolved trauma by minimizing it, by folding it into routine until it becomes invisible. The arrest disrupted that adaptation, forcing a reckoning that many had unconsciously postponed. Psychologists focused on the aftermath, particularly the moment when uncertainty is replaced by truth. They observed that resolution does not always bring relief. Sometimes it destabilizes coping mechanisms built around not knowing. The California 2005 cold case illustrated this paradox vividly. Answers arrived, but they did not arrive gently. They collided with years of emotional scaffolding, dismantling it abruptly. The justice system itself bore marks of the case long after proceedings ended. Internal audits referenced it as justification for ongoing review processes. Cold case units were no longer treated as symbolic gestures, but as essential components of investigative infrastructure. The idea that time weakens cases was challenged repeatedly. In some instances, time clarified them. Technology, often celebrated as the hero of delayed justice, played a quieter role in this narrative. It did not solve the case alone. It waited dormant until human attention returned. This distinction mattered. The case became a caution against technological determinism, a reminder that tools do not replace curiosity. They amplify it, but only when someone is willing to ask the right questions. The neighborhood, long removed from media scrutiny, developed its own relationship with the story. Residents spoke about it rarely, but when they did, their tone was measured, almost reverent. The case had taught them that certainty is fragile, and that appearances are negotiable. They did not become paranoid, but they became attentive. The difference mattered. New residents arrived with no personal memory of 2005, learning about it gradually, through whispers or late-night searches prompted by curiosity. For them, the case was history, something that had happened before they arrived. Yet even for them, the knowledge altered perception. The street felt the same, but it was no longer neutral. It carried context. In media retrospectives, the case was often framed as proof that justice eventually prevails. This framing was both comforting and incomplete. Those closest to it understood that justice had arrived, but it had arrived altered by delay. It did not restore time. It did not reverse consequences. It provided accountability, yes, but at a cost measured in years that could not be reclaimed. The quiet neighbor, now fully absorbed into the machinery of incarceration, ceased to be a subject of fascination. Their story no longer expanded. It contracted, becoming static, contained within legal boundaries. This containment felt appropriate. The narrative had never been about them alone. It had been about what allowed them to remain unseen for so long. The cold case also influenced how people interpreted silence in their own lives. Unanswered messages, unexplained absences, delays that once felt benign now carried potential weight. This shift was subtle but widespread. It did not produce fear so much as awareness, a heightened sensitivity to gaps where explanations should exist. In professional training, instructors emphasize the importance of revisiting early assumptions. They use the case to illustrate how narratives form quickly and resist change. Students were encouraged to question their own certainty, to treat confidence with suspicion. The message was clear. Truth does not always align with first impressions, and patience is not the enemy of progress. The victim's name continued to surface in meaningful ways. Grants, programs, quiet acknowledgments that ensured their life was not reduced to the circumstances of its end. These gestures mattered deeply to those who remembered them as a person rather than a case. They shifted focus from loss to impact, from absence to legacy. As cultural conversations about justice evolved, the case was occasionally revisited in broader discussions about delayed accountability. It served as an example of both the system's flaws and its capacity for correction. Critics pointed to the years of silence as unacceptable. Others highlighted the eventual resolution as evidence that persistence can overcome inertia. Both perspectives coexisted, unresolved, much like the case itself had once been. The passing of time did not dull the story's edges so much as it refined them. What once felt chaotic now appeared structured. What once seemed random revealed patterns. Distance provided clarity, but not comfort. The case remained unsettling precisely because it had unfolded quietly, without spectacle, hidden in routine. On certain nights when attention drifted and the world slowed, the story resurfaced unexpectedly. A documentary clip, a lecture reference, a passing mention in an unrelated discussion. Each time it carried the same underlying message. What goes unanswered does not disappear. It accumulates, waiting for recognition. The California 2005 cold case ultimately became a measure of resolve, not just for investigators or families, but for anyone who encountered it. It asked whether unanswered questions deserve patience or persistence, whether silence should be respected or challenged. It offered no definitive answer, only an example. As the years pressed on, the case settled into a paradoxical state. It was complete and incomplete at the same time. Solved yet still instructive. Closed, yet still active in the minds it had touched. This duality became its final form, its lasting contribution. The story no longer demanded belief or disbelief. It demanded attention. Not the fleeting kind reserved for headlines, but the sustained focus required to sit with discomfort. In that demand lay its power. And so the California 2005 cold case continued to exist, not as an event confined to the past, but as a presence woven into how people understood time, truth, and patience. It did not end when the verdict was read. It ended only when its lessons were absorbed, and even then it remained a quiet reminder that some answers take years to surface, and that waiting does not mean forgetting. The case had reached a point where it no longer needed momentum to survive. It moved on its own now, carried by implication rather than action, by the weight of what it had already revealed. In training rooms and late-night conversations, the California 2005 cold case was no longer framed as a mystery that had been solved, but as a phenomenon that had been endured. Its power came from duration, from the way it stretched across years and refused to fade, even after the machinery of justice had completed its work. Investigators who had once chased its earliest leads found themselves revisiting it in quieter moments, not to question outcomes, but to examine themselves. They asked what they had missed, not out of guilt but out of discipline. The case became a mirror, reflecting the limits of perception under pressure. It exposed how easily urgency can distort judgment, how quickly assumptions harden into doctrine. In that sense, the cold case was never really about one crime. It was about how systems learn or fail to. There was a strange humility that emerged from those reflections. Veterans spoke less about certainty and more about doubt. They admitted that time had taught them restraint, that waiting was not weakness but strategy. The California 2005 cold case had punished haste and rewarded patience, but not in obvious ways. Its resolution was not a triumphal moment. It arrived quietly, almost reluctantly, as if even the truth itself had hesitated before stepping forward. For the wider public, memory of the case existed in fragments. A headline remembered out of context. A documentary episode half-watched late at night. A name recognized but not fully recalled. Yet even in fragments the story retained force. People remembered how long it had taken. They remembered the neighbor. The midnight arrest. The shock that came not from violence but from proximity. From the realization that danger had once blended seamlessly into the ordinary. This realization lingered in subtle behavioral shifts. Doors locked earlier. Small talk extended a little longer, as if conversation itself could serve as verification. Communities did not retreat inward, but they recalibrated trust. The case did not create fear. It created awareness. The kind that does not announce itself, but quietly alters choices. The family, now living with the strange finality of answers, navigated a new silence. It was different from the silence of not knowing. This one was heavier, more deliberate. It carried the knowledge that no further revelations were coming, that the narrative had reached its official end, even if emotional closure remained elusive. They learned that certainty has its own cost, that knowing everything does not necessarily heal everything. They spoke privately about moments when they almost preferred the ambiguity, not because it was easier, but because it left room for hope. Resolution, by contrast, was definitive. It closed doors permanently. This was not regret but realism. The California 2005 cold case had taught them that truth can be both necessary and unforgiving. In legal circles, the case continued to surface as a reference point for delayed prosecutions. Attorneys debated its implications, the ethical boundaries of time, the balance between due process and delayed justice. Some argued that waiting weakened fairness. Others countered that accountability does not expire. The case offered no clear verdict on these debates. It simply existed as evidence that time complicates everything. Technology advanced further, rendering some of the tools once considered revolutionary almost quaint. Yet the case resisted being reframed as a technological victory. It reminded experts that innovation alone is inert without intent, that breakthroughs require someone to notice what others have overlooked. The California 2005 cold case was not solved by progress alone, but by return, by someone choosing to look again. That act of return became its most enduring lesson, not moving forward relentlessly, but circling back deliberately, reopening files, replaying interviews, re-examining conclusions that had once felt airtight. The case validated persistence over novelty, attention over speed. In a culture increasingly oriented toward immediacy, this lesson stood in quiet opposition. The narrative also challenged the idea of villains as visibly distinct. The quiet neighbor had not fit any established profile. They were not flagged by behavior, not isolated by reputation. Their ordinariness had functioned as camouflage. This realization unsettled deeply ingrained beliefs about how danger presents itself. It suggested that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it blends in, patient and unremarkable. Media portrayals struggled with this nuance. Simplification was tempting. Headlines favored clarity over complexity. Yet the deeper truth resisted compression. The case did not resolve into a moral parable. It did not offer easy warnings or obvious signs. It simply demonstrated how incomplete perception can be, even when intentions are good. As time passed, the emotional intensity surrounding the case softened, but it did not disappear. It matured into something quieter, more contemplative. People stopped asking, "How could this happen?" and began asking, "What does this teach us?" The shift was subtle but significant. It marked the transition from reaction to reflection. In educational settings, the case was sometimes presented not as a success story, but as a cautionary one. Students were encouraged to interrogate the timeline, to identify moments where alternative choices might have changed outcomes. The goal was not to assign blame, but to cultivate awareness, to recognize that the cost of certainty can be blindness. The California 2005 cold case also influenced how people understood waiting. Waiting was no longer passive. It became active, intentional, purposeful. The idea that something unresolved might still be unfolding beneath the surface gained credibility. This reframing extended beyond crime, touching how people approached unanswered questions in their own lives. There were moments when the case resurfaced unexpectedly, triggered by unrelated events. Another cold case reopened. Another arrest made decades later. Each time the memory reasserted itself, not demanding attention, but accepting it when offered. It had become part of a larger pattern, a chapter in an ongoing conversation about time and truth. The passage of years did not erase the initial shock of the midnight raid. That image remained vivid, symbolic. Not because of its drama but because of its timing. Midnight represented the boundary between days, between known and unknown. The arrest felt like a crossing, a moment when the past finally intruded into the present. Yet even that intrusion was restrained. There were no public spectacles, no cathartic release. Justice arrived with paperwork, procedure, routine. This understated conclusion felt appropriate. The case had never been loud. It had been persistent. Its ending reflected that character. As society continued to grapple with its own pace, the case stood as a counterexample. It argued, quietly but firmly, that not everything yields to urgency, that some truths require time not as an obstacle, but as an ingredient. The California 2005 cold case embodied this argument without articulating it explicitly. In the end, the case did not ask to be remembered for its resolution alone. It asked to be remembered for its endurance, for the way it lingered unsettled, until someone was willing to sit with its discomfort long enough to see clearly. That willingness became its legacy. And so the story persisted, not as a caution frozen in the past, but as a living reference. A reminder that answers can be delayed without being denied. That silence is not absence. That patience, when paired with attention, can eventually pierce even the deepest uncertainty.